Monarch butterflies are some of the most beautiful and iconic insects in Wisconsin. However, monarchs have experienced a dramatic population decline in the last 3 decades, due primarily to habitat loss and misuse of pesticides. Monarchs are habitat specialists. They can only lay their eggs on milkweed plants, and their caterpillars only eat milkweed. There are many species of insects who rely on milkweed to survive, and most of them are not only harmless, but are beneficial native pollinators just like monarchs. Like monarchs, many of them are brightly colored in reds and oranges, an adaptation to warn predators that they are not good to eat, thanks to the toxins they acquire from the milkweed. So who are these colorful neighbors?
So let's talk about milkweed longhorn beetles. These are perhaps one of the commonest insects that you'll see on milkweed here in the upper Midwest, especially in mid to late summer. You can often spot them. So month of July is a good time to see these. It's a native insect, and actually there's a number of species in that genus that we can tell apart by the coloration on their body, but they all have similar biologies. The adult females, after mating, will lay eggs at the base of the stem, and then once the eggs hatch, the grubs or larvae actually go down into the soil where they feed on the roots of milkweed plants. So you're not going to see these unless you go specifically digging for them, but they feed on the root material and then they overwinter, and the next spring they mature into adults and we get our batch of adults out in late summer. Now, although they feed on milkweed plants, they really don't seem to cause a whole lot of damage and really aren't a concern in terms of competing with monarch caterpillars out there. Again, the larvae feed on the roots of milkweed plants, so we're not going to see those. The adults will often chew notches out of the tips of milkweed leaves.
Milkweed longhorn beetles are herbivores and eat only plant material, so they will not harm monarch eggs, caterpillars, or butterflies.
So another common beetle on milkweed plants here in the Midwest is a swamp milkweed leaf beetle. And as you can guess from the name, they are very fond of swamp milkweed and kind of wetter, marshy areas, although they will go to common milkweed as well. So they can show up on a range of milkweed species. In terms of their biology and life cycle, they overwinter as adults, and so they can pop out relatively early in the growing season. They eventually mate and lay batches of eggs, typically on the undersides of leaves. And out of the eggs come these small grub-like or slug-like larvae, which feed on foliage of milkweed plants, eventually maturing, pupating, and transforming into adult insects. And similar to the milkweed longhorn beetles, they do feed on milkweed plants, but really don't seem to cause all that much damage. So there can be a very common insect that we see here on milkweed plants.
While swamp milkweed leaf beetles do feed on milkweed leaves, they are unlikely to cause significant damage to the plants, since they typically occur at low densities on individual milkweed.
So perhaps one of the easiest insects to identify in milkweed would be oleander aphids. And being aphids, these are small insects, plump pear-shaped bodies and yellowish in color. And one unique thing about them is they can reproduce parthenogenetically, meaning that the females can give birth to offspring without having to find a male to mate. And in fact, with oleander aphids, all of them are females. What that means is when a winged female colonizes a milkweed plant or patch of milkweed, if the conditions are just right, their populations can increase very rapidly, and you can usually find large numbers of these on plants. It's rare to find just 1 or 2 oleander aphids. You typically find a whole bunch of them together. So that can make it very conspicuous. All these tiny yellow aphids found together in large numbers. So in addition to reproducing via parthenogenesis, they not only can do that, but they give birth to live young rather than laying eggs. So that also gives them a leg up, and they can really take advantage of resources. Now, when they feed on milkweed plants, it doesn't really seem to cause that much damage in the grand scheme of things, although they do have these sucking type mouth parts. So they draw fluid out of plants and drink plant sap that can cause sometimes some discoloration and also some wilting-like symptoms. And often you'll see this up towards the tops of milkweed plants. In addition to causing that damage, they drink excess sugars from the plant, and they excrete these sugars as a substance we call honeydew. That can be a little bit of a nuisance problem because you get this sticky coating, and that can attract ants and wasps at times, but also a fungus called black sooty mold can grow on the honeydew and be a little bit of a nuisance as well. Now, in the grand scheme of things, these can cause a little bit of damage to milkweed plants, but if you have a big patch, it probably isn't going to impact monarchs at all. We also have to keep in mind, if you have lots of these aphids around, there's often many beneficial predators and parasites like lady beetles, lacewing larvae, hoverfly larvae, and parasitic wasps that help keep them in check in the long run.
Oleander aphids are herbivores and will not directly harm monarchs. When they occur in large aggregations, their heavy feeding may cause stunted growth on the terminal end of the milkweed, and the honeydew they secrete may allow unsightly mold to grow on the plant. In the case of a major infestation, aphids can be controlled using insecticidal soap or oil, which is less harmful to monarchs than other chemical insecticides.
So another insect very common on milkweed, especially late in the season, is the large milkweed bug. And this is a species that can't survive our winters here in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. So it actually migrates up from the southern states every year, and it often arrives in about early summer to midsummer. So we can find them in perhaps July, but once they get here, they mate, they lay eggs, and it takes about 40 to 45 days for those juveniles to reach maturity, which is often late summer. So late summer and into early fall, these can be very conspicuous, especially on upper portions of plants, and they often hang out on the pods of milkweed. Similar to aphids, these have sucking type mouthparts, so they do drink fluids out of the plant, but it seems to cause really pretty minimal damage, so not really a concern in terms of competing with monarchs on those plants, but something that can be very conspicuous late in the growing season. So in addition to the large milkweed bug, there's actually a small milkweed bug, which is a close cousin. They're a little bit smaller in size, but have a similar appearance. This is a species that can make it through our winters here in Wisconsin. So they generally overwinter as adults, become active early in the growing season, lay eggs, and we get the developing juveniles, or nymphs as we call them, which are going to be smaller than the adults, but somewhat similar in body shape and coloration. Eventually those reach maturity, and depending where you are in the US, you might get one or more generations. If you're in a location that's warmer, you may get a second or additional generations, but farther north, you only get one per year. Just like the large milkweed bug, small milkweed bugs do have sucking type mouthparts, so they drink fluid out of milkweed plants, but usually these are encountered in relatively low numbers, so really not any concern in terms of competition with monarch butterflies. Another interesting thing about small milkweed bugs is they can be omnivorous at times, meaning that they might feed on plants, but occasionally they can feed on other insects, but in the grand scheme of things, again, probably not much of a concern in terms of competition or predation upon monarchs.
As members of the seed bug family, Lygiidae, milkweed bugs primarily feed on the seeds of milkweed as well as the stems and leaves, using long, piercing mouthparts. Large groups of nymphs may congregate on seed pods late in the growing season. It can be alarming to see congregations of bright red milkweed bug nymphs chowing down on milkweed seed pods, but usually the seeds at the center of infested pods are unharmed. Milkweed bugs can be annoying if you are hoping to gather milkweed seeds, but should not adversely affect your mature milkweed plants. And while small milkweed bugs have been known to snack on other insects, including the occasional monarch caterpillar, they are unlikely to have population-level impacts on monarchs.
So when you think of caterpillars on milkweed plants, you of course probably think of monarchs and the butterflies that they turn into, but another common caterpillar is that of the milkweed tussock moth, which has a very distinctive fuzzy looking appearance, and they can be gregarious as young, so they will overwinter in the pupal stage, and then we get an adult moth relatively early in the growing season. The adult is fairly nondescript in appearance, but they mate, they lay batches of eggs on milkweed plants. Now those eggs become dozens of small caterpillars, which will feed gregariously. Eventually, as they mature and take on a slightly different appearance, they become more solitary, but those can continue to feed on milkweed plants with their chewing mouthparts. Now, you might consider them competitors with monarch caterpillars, but one thing to keep in mind is often these tussock moth caterpillars will be found on slightly older milkweed plants, and monarch caterpillars often will be spotted on younger plants. So even if they're present, if you have a lot of milkweed in a given patch, it's usually not an issue for monarch caterpillars.
When they've had their fill and reached their final caterpillar stage, the milkweed tussock moth will create a fuzzy gray cocoon where it will spend the winter pupating, ready to emerge in the spring as a moth. There's no doubt that milkweed tussock moths can demolish milkweed leaves in a hurry, and the herds of devouring larvae can be alarming to the conscientious gardener. However, it is unlikely that this herbivory will kill your milkweed. And it's important to remember that these critters are just as dependent on milkweed as monarchs are. By planting milkweed, you are not only supporting our beautiful monarchs, but all their neighbors too. Milkweed is critical for insect species like these with milkweed-dependent life cycles, as well as hundreds of other species of pollinators, including bees, ants, and other beetles. Concerned about an insect in your garden? Snap a few pictures and reach out to your local extension office for help identifying and managing the insect. Monarch butterflies are still in critical need of habitat. Planting milkweed and other native nectar plants can help monarchs thrive, with the added benefit of creating habitat for many other insect species.